It was a cold, wet afternoon when Marcus, just 8 years old, and his 11-year-old sister, Joan, decided to explore the trail behind their small town. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, and the air felt heavy with the smell of rain. They'd been walking for hours, the silence of the woods broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional rustle of animals hiding from the coming storm. When the first raindrops began to fall, they knew the storm wasn't far behind. Joan had an air of confidence that always made Marcus feel a little unsure of himself. She walked ahead of him now, her raincoat flapping around her like a cape, her red hair sticking to her face from the downpour. She often teased Marcus, calling him a baby when he wasn't brave enough to try things she thought were fun. It wasn't mean-spirited. Well, not always. But Marcus often wished she'd be nicer to him. Still, Joan was his sister, and he followed her now because he didn't want to be left alone in the woods this far from home. The path ahead grew narrower as they wandered deeper into the woods, and soon they found themselves standing before the old abandoned church. The building looked ancient, made of crumbling stone with ivy snaking up its walls. It sat at the edge of a small, overgrown graveyard. The tombstones leaned at odd angles, some cracked, and all seemed to be slowly sinking into the earth, swallowed by the relentless march of time. The rusted iron gate creaked in the wind, as if beckoning them inside. "We should take cover," Joan said, tugging her coat tighter against the growing chill in the air. Her voice was a little sharper now, the exhaustion of the hike starting to show through. Marcus glanced at the church, a shiver crawling up his spine. "It looks kinda creepy, don't you think?" Joan shrugged, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "It's just an old church, Marcus. Nothing more." Marcus frowned, but Joan was already galloping toward the gate. They ducked under the rusted archway and stepped into the graveyard. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets now, turning the ground to thick mud. They found shelter beneath a large oak tree at the far end of the yard, where the tombstones seemed to loom over them like dark sentinels. The sound of the storm hammered against the earth, but the tree's thick branches barely provided any refuge from the torrential downpour. The chill air made Marcus's skin crawl as his boots squelched in the mud. Joan immediately started scanning the names carved into the stones, her small fingers brushing away layers of wet moss and ivy with an almost exaggerated enthusiasm. Marcus hung back a little, keeping his distance as his eyes shifted nervously over the graves. "I bet you didn't know," Joan began, her voice suddenly lowering with mock seriousness, "that the road alongside this graveyard, it didn't always exist." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Joan glanced around dramatically, then leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "About 50 years ago, or maybe a little more, they decided to expand the road, but the graveyard was in the way. They didn't bother moving the graves properly. They just cut through the ground. Bulldozers tore through the coffins like they weren't even there. And the workers didn't think twice about what was found inside." Marcus frowned. "What did they find?" Joan smirked, leaning closer to one of the gravestones and brushing away the moss. "Some people say they saw bones sticking out, but no one cared. There was also talk about a human skull had fallen out and had rolled down the hill. The workmen just shoved everything aside and kept working. Ever since then, people say the ground hasn't been the same, like something underneath didn't like being disturbed." Marcus shuddered, the rain dripping down his neck. He glanced uneasily at the graves around him, their names barely visible beneath layers of moss and dirt. Some of the headstones had been leaned against the crumbling church wall, cracked and weathered, like they were just waiting to fall apart completely. These were more than likely the ones from them bulldozed graves, Marcus thought himself with a shiver. Joan flicked her hand over a headstone, brushing off some of the ivy to reveal the name, Lillian Gray. "You ever heard of Lillian Gray?" she asked, her voice lowering again. Marcus shook his head. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. "She was only 13, Joan said. "Got hit by a car while walking down the road here. People say her parents still come by sometimes, leaving flowers. But the weirdest part, people say she never really left. They say if you're out here alone at night, you can hear her whispering your name, waiting for someone." Marcus felt a cold twinge. "Joan, stop! You're scaring me!" Joan's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she moved to another gravestone, this one cracked and leaning at an odd angle. The name was barely visible, but the date was still legible, 1894. She squinted at it, then smirked. "This one," Joan began, lowering her voice, "as you can see, belonged to Edgar Blythe. He was the town constable, but he wasn't the kind of lawman you'd want to get on the wrong side of. He had a reputation for being cruel, and he wasn't afraid to use violence. They say people feared him more than they respected him." Marcus shivered, already feeling uneasy in the damp, gloomy graveyard. Joan's voice dropped even lower, drawing him in. One night, things went too far. Edgar had been chasing down a man, one of the local troublemakers, and instead of bringing him in, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He cornered the man right here near the edge of the graveyard. Joan paused, making sure she had Marcus's full attention. But the man fought back. He grabbed a spade that was leaning against the wall and swung it at Edgar. It was a clean blow. Edgar never saw it coming. His head was completely severed. Marcus felt another chill run down his spine. Edgar was dead, but his head was nowhere to be found. The police and locals searched the graveyard for days, but it was as though it had just vanished. Joan's eyes gleamed as she leaned in closer. "And they say Edgar's spirit never left," she whispered. "He's cursed to walk these grounds, searching for the head he lost. People say that if you're out here at night, you can still hear him, his footsteps slow and heavy as he stumbles around the churchyard." Marcus swallowed hard. "What happens if you see him?" Joan's grin widened and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "If you see him, you'll wish you hadn't. Because Edgar Blythe isn't just looking for his head, he's looking for revenge." "Wait," Joan whispered. "Did you hear that?" Marcus froze for a moment, a smile flickering across Joan's face as she grabbed his arm. "Run!" she hissed, a sudden sharpness in her voice. Marcus hesitated, his eyes locking on the darkness of the graveyard. He thought he saw something shift, a flicker in the shadows, but it was gone in an instant. He tried to shake it off, but the air felt heavier now, as if the very ground beneath his feet was pressing in on him. "Come on!" Joan yelled, and with that, she turned and bolted into the rain. Marcus froze, too scared to follow at first, his body paralyzed by the feeling that someone was out there watching him. His heart pounded as the scraping sound echoed again, louder, closer, moving toward him with a menacing rhythm. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He tried to call out to Joan, but the words stuck in his throat. Then he stumbled, his feet slipping in the mud as he tried to run, his arms flailing for balance. The world around him blurred with panic. Joan had disappeared into the night, leaving him behind in the dark. The rain hammered down, but the chill in the air was worse now, unnatural, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the storm. His boots squelched as he tried to get up, but his legs felt weak, his breath shallow. The shadows, they seemed to shift. Just out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a blur, a movement in the dark. Was it the wind, or was something else there? He couldn't tell. Cold draft cut through the trees, and Marcus glanced over his shoulder, heart racing. There was nothing there. But the unease, the crawling sensation of being watched, gripped him harder. The feeling of being surrounded by something that shouldn't be there, it pressed in on him from all sides. He stumbled to his feet, glancing around wildly. The graveyard was still, but the dark shapes between the tombstones, they didn't feel like shadows anymore. It was as if something was slipping through them, moving just out of sight, flitting between the crumbling gravestones and the twisted trees. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a cold sweat trickling down his spine. With his breath coming in ragged gasps, Marcus turned and ran, faster now toward the distant light of home, hoping that whatever was behind him would be left behind. His legs trembled beneath him, but when he finally made it back to the safety of the trail, the sounds of the night seemed to fade away. Yet, even as the rain continued to fall, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching him from the darkness, just beyond the reach of the trees, following him. By the time Marcus made it home, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but his heart was still pounding in his chest. When he stepped inside, the warmth of the home hit him like a wave, and began to remove his sodden coat and shoes. He glanced toward the kitchen, where his parents were talking in low voices. Joan sat at the table, her face flushed and her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Their mother's voice was firm, her tone sharp. Joan had been told off for leaving her brother behind like that, and now she was sulking about it. Marcus didn't say anything as he passed by her, though his eyes met hers for a moment. He could see the guilt in her face, but it didn't make him feel any better about what had happened. He rubbed his arms, still feeling the chill of the night, despite the warmth of the house. Something had been out there, something real. He could feel it in his bones. Later that night, after a hearty meal and a long hot bath to wash away the damp chill, Marcus lay in his bed, his eyes flicking around the darkened room. He rolled onto his side, pulling the blankets tighter around him, trying to chase away the cold that had crept into his bones. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. Joan's stories, the strange scraping sounds, the figure in the graveyard. The memory of that figure emerging from the shadows haunted him. It's just the storm playing trick on me, Marcus told himself, squeezing his eyes shut. Just Joan messing with me. She's always been good at scaring me. There's nothing out there. Just an old graveyard, that's all. But as the wind howled outside his window, he found it harder to convince himself. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt thick, oppressive. Something about the day just didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something darker. Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window. Through the thin curtains, just barely visible, was the outline of the old churchyard. It was far off in the distance, almost hidden by the trees and the fog rolling in. But it was there, a faint silhouette on the horizon, the old ruined graveyard. A shiver ran down Marcus's spine. He tried to look away, but his gaze remained fixed, drawn to it against his will. The feeling of being watched crept over him again, crawling under his skin, settling tight in his chest. With a grunt, Marcus shifted onto his back, trying to shake off the unease. "It's fine. It's nothing." He whispered the words in his head, hoping they would settle the storm of fear swirling inside him. But the longer he lay there, the heavier the silence became. The room felt too still, too quiet. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears. The air was cold now, despite the warmth of the blankets. The wind outside had softened, but the rustling of the trees made the night feel wrong. Marcus turned his head again, his eyes drifting back to the window. The churchyard still stood out there, barely visible, shrouded by fog, like a distant memory he couldn't quite reach. Then a faint sound reached his ears, like a breath, soft but unmistakable. It was almost as if someone was calling to him, whispering his name. "Marcus." Marcus froze. His heart skipped a beat. He was certain he hadn't imagined it. He sat up in bed, his breath caught in his throat. There was no one outside. He'd convinced himself there was nothing to be afraid of, but the voice. It wasn't his mind playing tricks this time. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. But Marcus could feel it now, the unease gnawing deeper inside him, spreading like cold fingers in his chest. "Marcus," the voice whispered again, clearer this time, soft, lilting, almost pleading. It was coming from outside. Terror gripped Marcus like a vice. The voice sounded so familiar, so real. It seemed to be calling him, urging him to come closer. His body was frozen, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the wind anymore. Then there was another noise, faint but unmistakable. A soft scrape like fingernails dragging across the floorboards. Slowly, his eyes slid back to the window, his body trembling. The fog had thickened outside, and the churchyard was almost entirely shrouded in shadow. There was no movement, nothing but the oppressive stillness of the night. Then, a third whisper, this time almost a plea, gentle but insistent. "Marcus, come back." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Marcus felt the weight of them pressing against his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The room had become impossibly still, the air thick with the feeling of something waiting. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to ignore the voice. But it was no use. The words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was calling him would always be out there, just waiting for him.